Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're diving deep into ancient Egypt, a civilization that, it just continues to captivate us, doesn't it? With its monumental pyramids, those enigmatic pharaohs, and really unique social structures.
Absolutely. It holds this enduring fascination.
And we've received source materials that invite us to explore two really significant and kind of interconnected questions. First, just how much power did women truly wield in this remarkable society? And second, what can we actually discern about female same-sex relationships from such a distant and, let's face it, often opaque past?
And what's fascinating here right off the bat is that both these questions immediately challenge so many of our modern assumptions. The historical evidence, as you'll see, is far more nuanced than simple yes or no answers would ever suggest.
Right, you can't just give a one-word answer.
Not at all. It requires us to look beyond those quick, often really oversimplified headlines and genuinely engage with the rich, complex historical context. So our mission in this deep dive is to meticulously sift through the often scarce, sometimes ambiguous, but honestly, endlessly intriguing evidence to bring you a more accurate and truly comprehensive picture.
And this deep dive is custom tailored for you, the learner, who wants to understand these complexities, maybe uncover some surprising facts, and experience those genuine aha moments, without ever feeling overwhelmed by just a flood of information.
We'll aim for that balance.
Exactly. We're going to strike a careful balance between the broad summaries and those vivid, memorable details and examples that really bring history to life. We want to ensure you walk away feeling truly well-informed.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, let's begin by setting the stage. Here's where it gets really interesting, I think. When we typically envision women in the ancient world, the prevailing image, it's often one of subjugation, right? Limited rights, severe societal constraints.
That's the standard picture, yes.
But ancient Egypt appears to be this striking, almost astonishing exception. So, what exactly did this seemingly unparalleled status mean for women in their daily lives? In practical terms.
Well, it meant they had a foundation of legal and economic autonomy that was genuinely extraordinary for the ancient world. Really remarkable. Unlike many contemporary societies, take Greece, Rome, or Mesopotamia, for instance, ancient Egyptian women were not generally treated as mere property, nor were they perpetual dependents under the legal control of a father, husband, or son. That's a key difference. Instead, their legal and economic rights were based primarily on their social class, not their gender.
So class trumped gender in that respect.
In many legal and economic aspects, yes. It means a noblewoman in Egypt had far more in common legally with a nobleman of her status than she did with, say, a peasant woman from Athens, or even a Roman matron in some regards. They were considered legally capax.
Capax, what does that mean?
It's a Latin term, but it fits the Egyptian concept well. It means competent and capable, fully able to act independently in the eyes of the law. This is a profound distinction.
That distinction really sets them apart. So what did being capax actually empower them to do, in their day-to-day existence?
Crucially, it gave them the explicit legal right to own, administer, buy, and sell property. And this wasn't just small items. It could include significant landed estates, houses, slaves, livestock, other valuable assets.
Wow, so real economic clout.
Absolutely. And this wasn't merely a theoretical right. We have substantial explicit evidence. Consider the fascinating will of Nonakte from De Medina. It dates to the 12th, 11th centuries BCE.
Nonakte. Tell me about her.
Well, this document, her will, it meticulously details her personal property, quite a substantial household, various servants, and it explicitly outlines how she designated her chosen inheritors. She even disinherited some of her own children.
Really? Why?
Because they had apparently neglected her in her old age. It's a powerful testament to her agency, her control over her own assets.
That is powerful, having the final say like that.
Indeed. And what's even more remarkable, something quite unique to Egypt, is that landed property, the core wealth, often descended through the female line, from mother to daughter.
Wait, through the female line, not father to son?
Often, yes, especially certain types of property or within particular family traditions. This provided a consistent and really significant economic power base for women across generations. It helped stabilize their financial standing within the family and the broader society.
So not only could they own land, but this core asset often stayed within the female lineage. That's a truly powerful inheritance system. What about their standing in the legal system itself? Could they actually, go to court?
Absolutely. Their legal competence, being capax, extended directly to the courtroom. They could represent themselves in legal proceedings.
Themselves. without a male guardian.
Correct. They could sit on juries, they could testify as witnesses, and crucially, they could initiate legal actions in their own name. This demonstrates a really robust legal framework that recognized women as independent legal persons, not just extensions of their male relatives.
That's a huge difference from somewhere like Athens.
A world of difference. And they could also freely enter into contracts, all sorts of contracts related to marriage, separation, property transactions, even employment agreements. This comprehensive legal freedom significantly shaped their personal lives, particularly when it came to marriage and divorce.
Divorce. You mentioned divorce. That was actually an option for women without facing huge social stigma. That sounds genuinely progressive for any ancient society.
It truly was.
Yeah.
Marriage in ancient Egypt, you see, was primarily a social and economic convention. Its main purpose was founding a house, ensuring the lineage continued, rather than being seen as a religious sacrament.
So, more practical than spiritual, in a way.
You could say that. And women generally had the autonomy to choose their own partners, which, again, wasn't always the case in other cultures. And yes, they possessed the right to initiate divorce at their discretion.
They could just say, I'm done.
Essentially, yes. While lifelong marriage was certainly the cultural ideal, divorce initiated by either party was possible and didn't carry the same heavy social stigma you might find elsewhere. We even have evidence of prenuptial agreements.
Prenups in ancient Egypt.
Yes, often written and legally binding contracts. And interestingly, they were frequently designed to favor the woman. For example, if a man initiated a divorce, he often had to forfeit any gifts exchanged during the marriage.
He'd lose the gifts.
Often, yes. And he was typically legally obligated to pay alimony to his ex-wife. Sometimes this continued until she remarried, or perhaps explicitly requested the payments to stop.
Wow, that's quite protective.
Very. And furthermore, in most divorce cases, the children and the family home typically remained with the mother. This really helped solidify her social and economic stability after the separation.
Wow, prenups that genuinely favored women. And it sounds like they also had a surprising degree of reproductive autonomy.
Indeed. When we look at medical papyri from the period, like the Cahun gynecological papyrus, they indicate that knowledge and access to various forms of birth control existed.
Birth control.
Yes. And even methods of abortion seem to have been available to both married and unmarried women. This degree of reproductive freedom was quite unusual for the ancient world, where such matters were often strictly controlled by male authority figures or rigid religious doctrines.
That is remarkable.
And it didn't stop there. If a woman became a widow, her legal freedoms often actually increased. Widows frequently found themselves with expanded control over inherited property. This enabled them to buy and sell land, make donations, even extend loans, all without needing a male guardian's permission.
So widowhood could almost be empowering, legally speaking.
In a legal and economic sense, yes, it often was. All of this together just underscores a truly remarkable level of personal and economic agency for women in pharaonic Egypt.
Okay, so beyond their impressive legal rights and personal autonomy, what about their daily contributions to the economy? Were they primarily confined to the domestic sphere, or did they have diverse professional roles?
Oh, far from being confined solely to the home. Ancient Egyptian women were actively and widely involved in diverse economic sectors. They were absolutely integral to agriculture, working in the fields alongside men, planting, harvesting.
Right alongside the men.
Yes. And they were the primary force in food processing. They were, in fact, the original beer brewers in Egypt. Beer was a staple food, so that was crucial. They were also much of the workforce in textile manufacturing, creating the linen that was essential to Egyptian life for clothing, sails, mummy wrappings, everything.
So they were making the beer and the cloth basically essentials.
Absolutely. They actively sold goods at the bustling markets along the Nile. And they could even assume their husband's duties if he was away, maybe on military campaign or trade expedition. They could competently manage businesses, farms, or workshops in his absence. Their labor was truly fundamental to the Egyptian economy.
So they were literally the backbone of many key industries. What about more specialized, maybe more steamed professions? Were there women in those kinds of high-status roles?
Absolutely. They held a variety of respected professional roles that required specialized skills and training. For instance, we know of Hatshepsut from the 4th dynasty, that's around 2500 BCE. Her title was Overseer of the Female Physicians.
Overseer of female physicians. So there were enough female doctors to need an overseer.
Exactly. And some evidence even suggests she served as a teacher at a medical school. This highlights their advanced professional standing in the field of medicine, right from the Old Kingdom.
That's incredible. What else?
Women could also become scribes, although this was less common than for men. Literacy wasn't as widespread for women. They could be priests, though, with some notable limitations developing in later periods. They could be seers, even dentists.
Dentists?
Yes, there's evidence for female dentists. And from the Old Kingdom onwards, they held the crucial and highly trusted position of sealers.
Sealers, what did they do?
Well, in a society without modern locks and keys, seals were vital for safeguarding property, ensuring the integrity of documents, locking storerooms. Sealers were the ones who applied and verified these seals. It indicates significant administrative involvement and the immense trust placed in them.
So essentially security and administration.
Precisely. And many women also skillfully transitioned their domestic management skills into well-paying jobs. They became household managers for the wealthy elite, supervising large retinues of servants, overseeing complex estates, and even organizing official events like lavish banquets for foreign dignitaries and local officials.
So this wasn't just about survival, it was about truly thriving and contributing in diverse professional capacities across the whole social spectrum.
Exactly. The remarkable breadth of their economic activities and professional roles directly correlates with their high legal status. If women could control their own wealth, manage businesses, earn their own income, they weren't solely economically dependent on male relatives.
Which gives them leverage.
Significant bargaining power, yes. Within their families, within their communities. It allowed for much greater self-determination. It's a compelling counter-narrative to the common perception of women in most other ancient societies.
But you mentioned earlier that ancient Egyptian society was still fundamentally patriarchal. How do we reconcile this incredible female agency with a male-dominated structure? That sounds like a bit of a paradox.
That's precisely the nuance we need to grasp. It is a kind of paradox from our modern viewpoint.
Yeah.
While ancient Egyptian society was undeniably patriarchal, meaning men predominantly held the highest political offices, the top military commands, the key state bureaucratic roles, women's legal equality with men of their same class, points to a very distinct form of patriarchy.
Okay, a distinct form. How so?
It wasn't an oppressive system that systematically stripped women of fundamental personal and economic rights across the board, like you saw elsewhere. Instead, it primarily confined formal political and religious leadership, especially at the highest state levels, to men, but with some very notable and fascinating exceptions, which we'll definitely get into.
Right, the female pharaohs.
Exactly. This blend allowed for significant female agency and autonomy within a generally male-dominated power structure. It was quite distinct from the near-total subjugation or legal incapacitation found in many contemporary cultures.
And this unique status, it wasn't static throughout Egyptian history, was it? You mentioned it declined over time.
Unfortunately, yes, it did. This uniquely high status for women began to erode, really quite significantly, from about the 4th century CE onwards. This decline coincides with the imposition of Greco-Roman laws as Roman influence grew stronger.
Ah, the Romans.
Yes, and also the widespread rise of Christianity in Egypt, which brought its own set of patriarchal norms. And then it declined even further after the 7th century CE Muslim Arab invasion.
So external influences played a big role in changing things.
A massive role. These external cultural and religious influences brought with them different legal traditions and moral frameworks that often curtailed the freedoms Egyptian women had long enjoyed under pharaonic rule. This historical trajectory really underscores the unique nature of pharaonic Egypt's treatment of women, and it highlights a crucial, often overlooked point. The path for gender equality throughout history isn't linear. It goes back and forth.
That's a powerful reminder. Progress isn't guaranteed.
Exactly. It shows how fragile even deeply embedded rights can be when external forces and different ideologies come into play.
So if women had all this personal agency, and some even held powerful economic and legal standing, how far up the power pyramid did they really go? Beyond managing their own property and maybe a business, could they truly rule the kingdom?
Yes. In truly exceptional circumstances, they could indeed reach the very apex of power. The influence of Queen Consorts, the Pharaoh's main wife, and especially Queen Mothers, was particularly significant. They often wielded considerable power, usually through their relationship to the male king.
The Queen Mother especially, why her?
Well, her vital role in producing the next legitimate heir, the future king, often provided a strong, legitimate basis for her unique rights and influence within the royal court. She was the link to the future dynasty.
And regency seems to have been a crucial, almost institutionalized pathway for women to exercise supreme authority, right?
It absolutely was. Regencies for underage pharaohs weren't just common. They were a recognized and you could say, institutionalized path to supreme executive authority for royal women. When a king died, leaving a young son who was too young to rule effectively.
The mother stepped in.
Typically, yes. It was usually his mother or sometimes a stepmother who would act as regent, effectively governing the entire kingdom in his name. And this wasn't just informal influence behind the scenes. It was a formal, albeit often intended to be temporary, assumption of the highest executive power.
So it was accepted.
It clearly shows how the biological and social role of motherhood, particularly in ensuring dynastic continuity, provided a legitimate and accepted basis for women to step into direct governance, sometimes even paving the way, as we'll see, to the kingship itself.
Do we have specific examples of these powerful regents and the kind of influence they wielded?
We certainly do. Going way back, Merneith, from the First Dynasty, around 2970 BCE, is a fascinating case. She served as regent for her son, Den. But her tomb at Abydos is incredibly elaborate, closely resembling those of Egyptian kings, complete with a burial boat.
Like a king's tomb.
Yes. And her name even appears on a king list from the period. This strongly suggests she might have ruled in her own right, not just as a temporary regent. Then there's Nethotep, also First Dynasty, maybe regent for Horaha.
So, right from the beginning of Egyptian history.
Pretty much. Moving forward centuries into the New Kingdom, you have Ahhotep I from the 18th dynasty, around 1550 BCE. She famously served as regent for her son, Ahmose I, the founder of the dynasty, and it's recorded that he consistently sought and followed her counsel, even awarding her military honors.
Military honors for a queen regent.
Yes, for her role in stabilizing the kingdom. Then there's Ahmose Nefertari, also 18th dynasty, ruled as regent for her son Amenhotep I. She was so revered that she was posthumously worshipped for centuries as a divine ancestress. These women weren't just placeholders. They exercised genuine power, made crucial decisions, and stabilized the realm during critical transitions.
And then, of course, some went even further.
Exactly. We have figures like Hatshepsut and Tuzret, both of whom started out as regents before taking that unprecedented step of becoming pharaohs in their own right.
That's a truly powerful transition from regent managing things for his son to pharaoh ruling absolutely. And when these women did assume the role of pharaoh, they weren't just like queenly figureheads, were they? They adopted all the traditional masculine symbols of kingship. What did that signify?
Precisely. And it's a really compelling cultural phenomenon. You see, ancient Egyptians actually seem to have preferred being governed by a woman with direct royal blood, a woman considered divine through her lineage, rather than by a man who lacked that immediate royal connection, especially during succession crises or dynastic instability.
So bloodline trumped gender in that ultimate instance.
In those specific crisis moments, it often seems so. And when these royal women did assume the absolute role of pharaoh, they made a very strategic and deeply symbolic choice. They adopted all the traditional masculine symbols and regalia associated with kingship.
Like the false beard.
Exactly. The false beard, the shendit kilt, the various crowns, the scepters, and the uraeus, that iconic stylized cobra worn on the pharaoh's brow, symbolizing royal authority and divine protection. This wasn't just playing dress-up, it was a crucial adaptation.
Why? Why adopt the male symbols?
To legitimize their rule within the deeply ingrained, highly gendered ideology of kingship. The pharaoh was seen as the divine intermediary between the gods and humans, the embodiment of Ma'at, cosmic order, a role traditionally conceived as male. To effectively occupy this position, a woman needed to visually and titularly align herself with these established masculine norms. Hatshepsut, for example, went even further.
How so?
She commissioned reliefs depicting her divine birth, claiming the supreme god Amun was her actual father, to further legitimize her unprecedented assumption of power. It was a masterful piece of political theology.
Let's talk about some of these female pharaohs in more detail. Who were the most significant, and what did their reigns actually entail? What did they achieve?
Well, the first historically confirmed female pharaoh, the earliest one we're quite sure about, was Sobekneferu. She was the last ruler of the 12th dynasty, ruling for about 4 years, roughly 1806 to 1802 BCE. Her reign seems to have been quite prosperous.
Sobekneferu, what was distinctive about her?
She consciously combined feminine and masculine markers in her public representations, in her statues and titles. She asserted her pharaonic authority while still acknowledging her gender. She seems to have been a strong personality, quite intelligent, and managed to stabilize the kingdom at the end of a powerful dynasty.
Okay. And then there's the really famous one.
Hatshepsut, yes, from the 18th dynasty. Arguably one of the most significant and successful pharaohs in all of Egyptian history, male or female. She ruled for nearly 20 years, from roughly 1479 to 1458 BCE.
20 years is a long reign.
A very substantial reign. She initially transitioned from regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III, to becoming his co-ruler, and then pretty quickly asserted full independent pharaonic authority.
And what was her reign known for?
It was marked by immense artistic creativity and ambitious building projects. Her stunning memorial temple at Deir el-Bahri, on the west bank of Thebes, is an absolute architectural marvel with its multi-terrace design. She also famously renewed trade, most notably sending a grand expedition down the Red Sea to the distant land of Punt, probably modern-day Eritrea or Somalia.
The expedition to Punt, what did they bring back?
All sorts of exotic goods: frankincense, myrrh, ebony, ivory, gold, exotic animals, and even living incense trees, which they planted in temple gardens. It was a huge success that significantly boosted Egypt's economy and international prestige.
Fascinating. And Nefertiti is often mentioned in this context too, right? Though her role is sometimes debated.
Yes, Queen Nefertiti. She was the chief consort of Akhenaten in the later 18th dynasty during his revolutionary religious period focused on Atonism, the worship of the sun disk. She was uniquely influential during his reign.
How influential?
She was often depicted in art as his near equal, sometimes even wearing the pharaoh's blue crown or shown smiting Egypt's enemies, an act traditionally reserved only for the king. Her prominence in official art and religious texts is unparalleled for queen consort.
Did she rule as pharaoh herself?
That's the big debate. Some scholars believe she might have ruled briefly as pharaoh, perhaps under the throne name Neferneferuaten, after Akhenaten's death and before Tutankhamun took the throne. The evidence is ambiguous, but suggestive.
Interesting. Who else?
Then we have Tuscrain. She was the last pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, ruling around 1191-1189 BCE. She followed a similar path: queen consort, then regent for a young king, before officially declaring herself pharaoh. She adopted a mix of male and female titles.
And how did her reign go?
Unfortunately, her reign was quite brief and seems to have ended in civil war, leading to the rise of the 20th dynasty. And of course, we have to mention the most famous female ruler of Egypt, though from a much later period: Cleopatra VII Philopator.
Cleopatra. Everyone knows Cleopatra.
Indeed. From the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek dynasty ruling Egypt. She ruled from 51 to 30 BCE. She famously asserted her sole authority by removing her younger brother and co-ruler's name and face from official documents and currency. She leveraged her sharp intellect and political acumen in an ultimately doomed attempt to preserve Egypt's independence against the rising power of Rome.
But despite their absolute rule, their success in some cases, these female pharaohs faced significant challenges, didn't they? You mentioned attempts to erase them from the historical record.
Indeed. That's a really crucial part of the story. The very fact that their rule often arose during crises, periods of dynastic instability, succession issues, lack of suitable male heirs, suggests it was often viewed as a pragmatic, perhaps necessary response to extraordinary circumstances, rather than a societal embrace of female leadership as the norm.
A sort of emergency measure?
In some ways, yes. And critically, attempts were made by their successors to erase them from official records and king lists. This practice is known as damnatio memoria, condemnation of memory.
Who did this?
Thutmose III, Hatshepsut's stepson and successor, launched a systematic campaign decades after her death to deface her monuments, chisel out her name from inscriptions, and replace her image with his own or his father's. Similarly, Setnakte, the founder of the 20th dynasty, sought to remove Tusret from the official record, portraying her reign as illegitimate.
Why would they do that?
It reveals a deeper societal discomfort, particularly within the male elite and priesthood perhaps, with female supreme authority. It suggests that while individual women could achieve immense power under specific circumstances, the underlying patriarchal system often sought to reassert itself and normalize male rule after their reigns ended. It's a powerful illustration of the resilience of established gender roles and ideologies.
So just to clarify, while women could, in exceptional cases, ascend to the throne as pharaohs, they generally weren't found in the day-to-day administration or the high-state bureaucracy. It seems like a very specific kind of power. They could wield the ultimate symbolic power, but not necessarily the everyday running of the state.
That's a crucial distinction, yes. Despite these exceptional rulers, women rarely held the important positions in the formal day-to-day administration or the highest echelons of the state bureaucracy. While, as we said, some wealthy women in the Old Kingdom owned large households and could employ other women in administrative roles within their personal estates and could head businesses.
Right.
The high state positions like vizier, the chief minister, treasurer, chief steward, or military generals were almost exclusively male occupied throughout most of Egyptian history.
Was there any exception?
There is one truly exceptional case often cited: a woman named Nebet, who served as a vizier in the 6th dynasty, way back around 2300 BCE.
A female vizier, that's the highest office besides pharaoh.
Exactly. Her appointment was highly unusual, perhaps unique, and is generally seen as a singular anomaly. It really underscores the general male dominance in the formal political bureaucracy that managed the state.
So this raises an important question, doesn't it? Why did a society that allowed women such unparalleled freedom in their personal and economic lives, and even allowed them occasionally to become pharaohs, still largely restrict them from that formal daily bureaucratic power?
It really does. It suggests a distinction was being made between the absolute, almost divine monarchical power, which could, under specific, often crisis-driven circumstances, be legitimately held by a woman of royal blood, and the established, everyday bureaucratic infrastructure that ran the country, which remained overwhelmingly male. It illustrates a really complex interplay of power, gender, tradition, and the practical structures of governance in ancient Egypt.
That's a fascinating point. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Against this backdrop of unique female agency, economic independence, and even occasional supreme power, what does all this mean for understanding same-sex relationships among women in ancient Egypt? The sources tell us the evidence is scarce, but as you often say, absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence.
You're absolutely right to preface it that way. The challenges of studying ancient sexuality, especially female same-sex relationships, are profound. We're dealing with an inherent scarcity of direct, explicit evidence. It's just not something that was commonly recorded, or perhaps recorded in ways we easily recognize.
Why is it so difficult?
Well, several reasons. Ancient texts often use euphemistic or symbolic language when discussing sexuality, making direct interpretation incredibly difficult. Plus, there's the fundamental problem of applying our modern identity constructs like lesbian or gay to historical contexts that simply lacked those terms or concepts. People didn't think of themselves in those categories.
Right, the concepts didn't exist for them.
Precisely. So the broad scholarly consensus is that homosexuality in ancient Egypt is a disputed subject, with really only a handful of direct clues that are often vague and subject to speculation. We have to be extremely cautious.
So just to be clear, we can't really say if someone was gay or lesbian in the modern sense because the concept simply didn't exist for them.
Exactly. That point is paramount for scholarly accuracy and avoiding anachronism. Ancient Egyptian society did not possess or utilize our modern concepts or terms for heterosexuality or homosexuality as fixed identities. Individuals wouldn't have self-identified with these labels, nor would society have categorized people that way.
So what are we looking for then?
When contemporary discussions turn to lesbianism or homosexuality in this context, the focus is primarily on interpreting instances of same-sex behavior or relationships as we might perceive them through a modern lens. We're looking for evidence of intimacy, affection, perhaps sexual acts between people of the same sex, rather than trying to identify fixed sexual identities akin to how we understand them today. That distinction is crucial for understanding the limits of our historical inquiry.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier that marriage in ancient Egypt was more about practicality and social order than anything else. How did that cultural emphasis factor into how same-sex unions might have been perceived?
That's a key part of the context. Marriage was indeed primarily a social and economic arrangement. The explicit goals were founding a house, producing legitimate heirs to continue the family line, and regulating property inheritance. It wasn't typically viewed as a religious sacrament in the way many later cultures would define it.
Property and kids.
Essentially, yes. While premarital sexual activity seems to have been generally acceptable, once married, couples were ideally expected to be sexually faithful, and there was a very, very strong cultural emphasis on fertility and procreation. Children were highly valued, seen as a blessing, ensuring continuity for the family and for society as a whole.
So how does that relate to same-sex relationships?
Well, the clear and practical understanding that homosexual relationships do not produce children likely meant that formal, publicly recognized same-sex marriage, particularly within that procreative framework, probably didn't exist or wasn't officially sanctioned within the main societal structure. The primary purpose of marriage just wasn't fulfilled.
That makes sense.
And this core methodological challenge, the lack of explicit terms, the focus on procreation, means we have to be incredibly careful. We're not looking to categorize ancient lesbians using our modern identity framework. We're searching for any indications, however subtle, of female same-sex intimacy, desire, or relationships, and trying to understand how they might have been perceived within their own cultural context. The societal focus on procreation doesn't necessarily mean outright prohibition of other relationships, but it certainly framed what was considered a legitimate or publicly acknowledged union in the eyes of society.
Okay, let's unpack this. If explicit records of female same-sex relationships are so rare, what are the actual handful of direct clues that scholars are working with? What surprising facts have they managed to uncover from these hints?
Okay. One of the most prominent pieces of archaeological evidence, one that continues to spark debate, is a limestone statue. It depicts two women named Idet and Ruyu.
Idet and Rui. Where was this found?
It dates from the New Kingdom, specifically around 1380-1390 BCE, and was discovered in the necropolis of Thebes near modern-day Luxor. It's now housed in the Museo Egizio in Turin, Italy.
And what's so striking about it?
The statue depicts the two women embracing for all eternity, which is a common theme in funerary art. But they're shown in a pose often described as typical to married couples in ancient Egyptian funerary art.
How so? What's the pose?
The way they are positioned, with an arm around each other, one hand perhaps holding the other, their bodies subtly intertwined. It closely mirrors depictions of heterosexual married couples. These poses were intended to signify eternal devotion and partnership in the afterlife. So this iconography is compelling because it strongly suggests a deep, intimate bond, leading some scholars to interpret their relationship as possibly being a same-sex couple.
That sounds pretty clear, but you said it's still debated. Despite the compelling imagery, it's not a definitive interpretation.
No, it's not definitive, and that's a crucial point about interpreting ancient evidence, especially visual evidence. The inscription on the statue itself gives Idet priority. She's on the side of honor, the right side, and identified with the title Lady of the House, a common honorific for a married woman and head of a household.
Okay, so Idet was maybe the dominant partner or head of household.
Possibly. But Rui, the other woman, is given no specific title in the inscription. It also includes a standard offering formula for Idet to the god Osiris, a common funerary invocation. So, scholarly debate persists.
What are the other interpretations?
Alternative interpretations suggest the women could be mother and daughter, or perhaps sisters, or even just very close friends or relatives. Their precise kinship isn't explicitly spelled out in the accompanying text. And the absence of explicit marital terms, phrases like his beloved wife, which are typically found on statues of heterosexual married couples, further adds to the ambiguity.
So it's suggestive, but not conclusive.
Exactly. So while some historians, maybe even most who look at it closely, do consider this as one of the potential pieces of evidence for same-sex relationships, it absolutely must be viewed with careful consideration of its context and the inherent interpretive challenges.
Right. What's fascinating here, though, is how this statue forces us to confront these challenges, doesn't it? The hermeneutical challenges in archaeology.
It really does. That eternal embrace could, with equal plausibility, signify deep kinship and familial devotion just as much as romantic love, especially given the profound importance of family bonds in ancient Egyptian funerary beliefs and practices. It illustrates vividly how much of our understanding of such ancient human relationships relies on interpretation, which is, by its very nature, open to multiple, often equally valid readings.
Okay, so that's one intriguing piece of archaeological evidence. Beyond statues, what about textual references? Are there any explicit mentions in ancient Egyptian texts themselves that might shed light on female same-sex relationships?
This is where we have to be incredibly careful about the source's origin and potential biases. One significant external textual reference comes much later, from Jewish Talmudic literature, specifically from Maimonides, who was a highly influential 12th century CE Jewish scholar and philosopher living in Egypt at the time.
Maimonides. What did he say?
He explicitly referred to lesbianism as the acts of Egypt. And this phrase, interestingly, later became a widespread euphemism for female same-sex acts within Jewish discourse for centuries.
The acts of Egypt. So from an outside perspective, it was associated with Egypt.
It suggests that yes, whether accurately or as a kind of cultural stereotype, such practices were associated with Egypt in the minds of some later Jewish writers. Now, earlier Jewish commentaries, like the Sifra from the 2nd century CE, even suggest an awareness of something they called the Roman practice of women marrying other women.
So they were aware of female unions elsewhere, too.
Seemingly. And later Talmudic discussions from the 5th century CE, while again external to Pharaonic Egypt, refer to something called mesolot. This term describes female homoerotic behavior, specifically tribadism. And interestingly, at that time, it was considered a minor infraction that didn't even disqualify a woman from marrying a priest in Jewish law.
A minor infraction, so not a huge deal back then in that context. But you said Jewish views evolved and became more condemnatory.
Yes, that's a clear trajectory we see in those external texts. While earlier Jewish texts viewed Mesalot as a relatively minor transgression, Maimonides, writing centuries later in the 12th century, suggested that courts should administer a flogging for such behavior.
Flogging, why the change?
He viewed it not just as a moral wrong, but as actively threatening to the institution of marriage and a significant deviation from normative behavior. This clearly demonstrates how external cultural and religious views can dramatically shape and even distort or demonize the historical narrative and judgment of past practices over time.
So we have to be careful not to take that as direct evidence of Egyptian views.
Absolutely crucial. It's an external Jewish religious text, reflecting their evolving moral and religious frameworks, not an internal Egyptian document from the pharaonic period. It might reflect a stereotype, a generalized perception, or perhaps observations from his own time in Egypt, rather than a direct, unbiased reflection of ancient Egyptian societal norms from millennia earlier.
That's a vital distinction to make. So, are there any internal Egyptian texts that shed direct light on this? Something offering an actual Egyptian perspective from the time?
There is one very rare and direct internal Egyptian perspective that scholars interpret cautiously. It comes from the Carlsberg Papyrus of the 13th Dream Book.
A dream book.
Yes, these were ancient texts used for divination, interpreting the meaning of dreams as signs and portents for an individual's future. This particular papyrus, originating from within Egypt, contains a specific divinatory claim. It states, "If a woman dreams that a woman has intercourse with her, she will come to a bad end."
She will come to a bad end. That sounds negative.
It certainly does. This is a crucial internal clue because it suggests a negative connotation or disapproval of female same-sex sexual acts within at least some religious or moral frameworks prevalent in ancient Egypt. If dreaming about something predicts a bad end, it implies the act itself was viewed negatively, as a transgression or something associated with misfortune.
So it implies a moral or religious disapproval, maybe, but not necessarily a formal legal prohibition that would lead to punishment or social ostracization.
Exactly. That distinction is vital for a nuanced understanding. Something can be morally or religiously frowned upon, considered taboo, or seen as bad within a society's belief system without being formally criminalized or legally prohibited by state law. This suggests that while there might have been some societal disapproval of overt female same-sex sexual acts, perhaps especially if they were seen as diverting from the primary procreative purpose of marriage, it doesn't automatically mean such relationships were entirely forbidden or aggressively suppressed by the state. It suggests they might have existed in a more private, perhaps tacitly tolerated, or simply unremarked upon sphere, carrying social or spiritual implications rather than direct legal ones.
That makes sense. What other potential indicators do we have, even if they're from later periods of Egyptian history, maybe after pharaonic rule?
We find some of the most explicit direct evidence in later periods, specifically during the Roman occupation of Egypt, from around the 2nd to 4th centuries CE. This comes in the fascinating form of papyri containing magical texts, specifically love spells.
Love spells.
Yes. And some of these are explicitly love spells commissioned by women to make other women fall in love with them.
Wow. Commissioned by women for women.
Exactly. These magical spells are particularly noteworthy for several reasons. First, they were often commissioned by women from lower social classes, suggesting these desires and relationships weren't confined just to an elite, isolated sphere. Second, and crucially, they explicitly contain the names of ancient women with clear homoerotic desires.
Can you give an example?
Sure. There's a spell commissioned by a woman named Herais seeking to magically bind another woman, Serapius, to her in love. Another involves a woman named Sophia seeking the affections of Gorgonia. These spells provide direct textual evidence of same-sex attraction and the active pursuit of such relationships within the ancient Egyptian population, even if it was under Roman rule by this time.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, I think. This isn't just about ancient history. It's about the history of how we interpret history, right? And how modern biases can literally hide evidence from us.
That's a critical point, and these love spells are a prime example of exactly that. It's deeply significant and frankly disturbing that the explicitly homosexual nature of some of these spells was actually erased or deliberately obscured in earlier translations.
Erased? How?
By modern scholars, often working in the 19th and early 20th centuries, whose own prevailing homophobic biases led them to misinterpret, mistranslate, or simply omit the clear same-sex nature of the spells. They might translate female names as male or change pronouns to fit a heterosexual norm.
So they just rewrote history to fit their own views.
Effectively, yes. It was only through later, more critical scholarship in the late 20th and early 21st centuries by scholars willing to confront those earlier biases that the original homoerotic elements were accurately restored and acknowledged. It highlights the profound, sometimes insidious impact of modern biases on historical interpretation.
That's incredible.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it underscores the absolute importance of continually reevaluating and retranslating historical sources with an open and critical eye. It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just a static set of facts handed down to us, but an ongoing process of interpretation, discovery, and sometimes correction of past mistakes.
What about visual depictions from these later periods, or even earlier? Anything that hints at female intimacy, even if not explicitly sexual?
Yes. Generally, depictions of women during the New Kingdom era, for example, do suggest they enjoyed a relatively relaxed and intimate atmosphere when in the company of other women. We see scenes in tombs or on papyri showing women interacting closely, grooming each other, sharing food and drink at banquets, sometimes depicted scantily clad or even nude in bath settings or private quarters.
So a comfort level with female closeness.
Exactly. And some cosmetic items, like unguent jars or mirror handles, also feature nude and sometimes suggestive depictions of women, often in pairs or groups, sometimes in sensual poses. Now, while these visual elements don't explicitly denote same-sex relationships in a definitive way, they do indicate a cultural comfort with female intimacy and the female body.
Okay.
This might have created a broader cultural backdrop that could have accommodated diverse forms of female relationships, whether purely platonic or potentially romantic or erotic. It implies, perhaps, a less rigid or restrictive societal gaze on female bodies and their interactions compared to some other cultures.
And then, as you mentioned earlier regarding Maimonides, we see a much clearer and much more explicit shift in attitudes later on, especially with the rise of Christianity in Egypt.
A very clear and undeniable shift towards condemnation, yes. By the 5th century CE, with Christianity firmly established as a dominant force in Egypt, we have concrete evidence of explicit condemnation of same-sex relations. A particularly stark example comes from a letter written by Shenut.
Shenut, who was he?
He was the powerful and influential abbot of the White Monastery in Upper Egypt, a major figure in early Coptic Christianity. In this letter, he chastises two women from his monastic community named Thais and Sonsno.
What did he accuse them of?
He accuses them of pursuing each other in friendship and physical desire, a phrase explicitly referring to homosexual advances or a relationship perceived as such. And the text indicates that corporal punishment was prescribed for such behavior.
Corporal punishment? Like what?
Specifically, flogging. This unequivocally reflects the imposition of new, less tolerant Christian moral and religious frameworks, which were significantly stricter and more condemnatory regarding sexuality than earlier pharaonic norms seem to have been. It marks a clear decline in the implied tolerance, or perhaps the simple, unremarked upon existence of same-sex relations from earlier periods.
So the contrast is really stark.
It really is. And this raises an important question, doesn't it? The stark contrast between the implied tolerance or lack of explicit legal prohibition in much of the pharaonic period and the unambiguous explicit condemnation and punishment in the later Christian period is truly insightful. It underscores that the unique power and relative freedom of women in ancient Egypt wasn't immutable. It was deeply contingent on the prevailing cultural and religious systems. We see a very clear cause and effect relationship here. A change in dominant belief systems profoundly impacted societal acceptance and the legal standing for various forms of human experience, including same-sex intimacy.
That's a really important point about cultural shifts. Okay, so we've explored the subtle and often ambiguous clues for female same-sex relationships. But what about male same-sex relationships in ancient Egypt? Does the historical record offer more evidence or perhaps different kinds of insights when we look at men?
It certainly offers a valuable comparative lens, yes. And arguably, there is more documentation related to male same-sex acts, though it remains vigorously debated and often carries negative connotations. The best known and most widely discussed case is that of Yenkhnum and Khnumhotep.
Yenkhnum and Khnumhotep. Who were they?
They were two high officials who served as royal manicurists and overseers of the palace hairdressers in the 5th dynasty, way back around 2400 BCE, so quite early.
Royal manicurists. Okay, what's special about them?
They were buried together in a single shared mastaba tomb at Saqqara. A mastaba is that type of ancient Egyptian rectangular flat-roofed burial structure with sloping sides.
Oh.
And the tomb contains really striking paintings.
What do the paintings show?
They depict the two men in poses of extreme intimacy. They're shown embracing each other closely, and in one famous scene, they're touching nose on nose, a gesture often interpreted as a kiss or a sign of deep affection in ancient Egyptian art. Their wives and children are also depicted, but more peripherally. The focus is really on the bond between the two men.
That sounds like a remarkably clear indication of a same-sex couple being honored together in death. But you mentioned there's still vigorous debate, even with that imagery.
Yes, absolutely. Despite the compelling visual evidence, scholars vigorously debate the precise nature of their relationship. Some Egyptologists interpret them as clear evidence of a same-sex couple, citing the unprecedented intimacy depicted for men of equal status in Egyptian art. It goes far beyond what was typically shown for brothers or friends.
So some see it as proof. What's the counter-argument?
Other scholars suggest they were very close relatives, perhaps even twins, though that's less likely given their names, or just exceptionally close brothers or colleagues. They argue that the imagery could signify deep fraternal affection, perhaps intensified and acceptable within the specific context of funerary beliefs about eternal companionship.
Any other interpretations?
There's one particularly interesting interpretation by the Egyptologist Greg Reeder. He points out that in one scene, Clumhotep is shown smelling a lotus flower. In Old Kingdom art, this activity is typically reserved for women or sometimes depicted for the passive partner in sexual scenes. Reader suggests this might imply Khnumhotep was depicted as taking on a metaphorical woman's role in the relationship.
Taking the woman's role.
Yes, which would potentially align with certain ancient Near Eastern patterns of understanding male same-sex intimacy, where roles were sometimes conceptualized in gendered terms. But again, this is interpretation. The debate highlights just how challenging it is to definitively interpret ancient social norms through limited visual evidence, even seemingly clear evidence.
Fascinating debate. What about mythological narratives? Do any of them hint at male same-sex encounters among the gods?
Absolutely. The mythological narrative featuring a sexual encounter between the gods Horus and Set is quite prominent and appears in several texts.
Horus and Set, they were enemies, weren't they?
Archenemies, yes. In the myth, Set attempts to sexually assault Horus, often while Horus is sleeping. In most versions, the act is initiated or completed, but Horus cleverly manages to catch Set's semen in his hand, preventing contamination or impregnation, and later uses it to trick and humiliate Set.
So it's depicted as assault or dominance, not desire.
Primarily, yes. The act is frequently interpreted by scholars not as an expression of mutual desire, but as sexual assault or an act of humiliation intended to assert dominance. Set is trying to dishonor Horus, prove his own virility, and gain power over him. The passive role in this narrative is consistently stigmatized and associated with weakness, submission, or disgrace.
But you said primarily. Are there other versions?
It's worth noting that some versions of the myth, like those found in the Kahun papyri, do seem to indicate a degree of homosexual desire on Set's part for Horus. This is considered somewhat unusual for Egyptian literature and potentially reflects negative societal views, given that Set is consistently associated with disruption, chaos, foreignness, and lawlessness in Egyptian mythology. Achieving homosexual desire to him might have been another way to characterize him negatively.
Okay, so mythology gives us a complex, mostly negative picture related to power. Are there any direct mentions of male same-sex acts in religious texts or even personal confessions from living, things people had to avoid?
Yes, there are some, though again, often open to interpretation. For example, in the Book of the Dead, which contains spells to help the deceased navigate the afterlife, we find the negative confessions lists of sins the deceased claims not to have committed.
Right, like the Ten Commandments, but in reverse.
Sort of. And the 27th confession, as found in the Papyrus of Nebseni, reads, "I have not committed acts of impurity, neither have I lain with men." This clearly suggests that lying with men was considered an act of impurity or a moral transgression that could negatively impact one's judgment in the afterlife.
So it was something to deny doing.
Exactly. Another specific confession, often found inscribed in tombs as part of moral codes, states something like, "I did not ink a NKKW." This is a very specific phrase. And while the exact meaning is debated, it's loosely translated by many Egyptologists as, "I did not have penetrative sex with this sexually passive male."
Focusing on the passive role again.
Precisely. This implies that male homosexuality, particularly taking the passive role, was considered a sin or was frowned upon as a moral offense, could threaten one's afterlife judgment or social standing. Then there's the 30-second maxim from the Instructions of Ahhotep, a famous wisdom text offering advice for ethical living.
What does that say?
It warns a young man against venting sexual desire on a woman-boy. This seems to refer to a boy prostitute, perhaps one who takes the female role in the encounter. But Intriguingly, the text notes that while the act itself is warned against, it does not reflect on the character of the active partner and has no social consequences for him.
So it seems like for men, the active partner didn't face social consequences, but the passive one did. And there was maybe a sense of social disgrace attached, like what that Pharaoh Neferkari you mentioned?
Precisely. This suggests a significant gendered asymmetry in societal perception and judgment. The famous, somewhat scandalous account of Pharaoh Pepi II Neferkare, who reportedly snuck out at night to spend time with his general, Sassanet, led to him being disgraced in some accounts.
Why was he disgraced?
The disgrace was possibly due to the unequal social status between the pharaoh and his general, the clandestine nature of the exploits perhaps suggesting shame, or maybe because homosexual intercourse, particularly the passive role, could also be used metaphorically as a sign of defeat and humiliation in military or power contexts. So for the pharaoh to potentially engage in such acts, or even be rumored to, could diminish his kingly authority.
So the picture for men seems more documented, but also more complex, often tied to shame and power.
Yes. While some sources might suggest male homosexuality was viewed as perhaps odd, but very likely tolerated, in the sense that there were no clear legal punishments codified for the active partner, other sources strongly emphasize negative social and religious connotations, especially surrounding the passive role and power dynamics. The overall record implies a societal discomfort or disapproval, particularly concerning these aspects of power, status, and the perceived active versus passive roles.
So what's fascinating here is how the societal concerns surrounding same-sex acts seem to have been profoundly gendered, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. For men, the anxieties recorded in our sources were often deeply intertwined with concepts of dominance, status, maintaining social hierarchy, and the perceived implications of who was active or passive. These factors could carry significant social stigma, particularly for the one perceived as passive.
There is for women.
For women whose societal roles, even when powerful, were less overtly focused on public dominance or military leadership in the same way, similar anxieties about active-passive roles might not have manifested or been recorded in the same manner. This could partly explain why their stories and relationships are even more elusive in the historical record. It underscores that historical silence isn't always absence. It can also be a reflection of what a particular society, especially its male record keepers, prioritized for documentation or found particularly concerning.
That's a really insightful way to put it. Okay, so what does this all mean when we try to synthesize these glimpses, these debates, these ambiguities? How do scholars manage to give us a nuanced understanding of ancient Egyptian sexuality without oversimplifying things or just projecting our modern ideas onto the past?
Well, the first thing is to constantly acknowledge the limitations. The overarching scholarly consensus remains that evidence for homosexuality in ancient Egypt, especially concerning female same-sex relationships, is undeniably scarce and vague. And what evidence we do have is often subject to speculation.
Right, the statue, the dream book.
Exactly. We also have to remember that ancient Egyptian documents often employed flowery and euphemistic paraphrases when describing sexual acts of any kind, making direct and unambiguous interpretation incredibly problematic. And unlike, say, ancient Greece, where a specific named social model like pederasty existed for certain forms of male same-sex relationships, even if controversial itself,
There's nothing like that in Egypt.
no equivalent formalized social model for homosexuality has been identified in Egypt, which further complicates our understanding of how such relationships might have fit into the social fabric.
And sometimes, as we've discussed, the interpretations themselves seem to conflict. Some scholars emphasize the scarcity of evidence, while others might suggest there's a lot of evidence if you interpret certain things differently, or point out that nothing indicates it was forbidden or illegal. How do we reconcile that apparent paradox?
That's an important point, and it's not necessarily a contradiction, but rather a reflection of a more nuanced understanding of what tolerance or acceptance might mean in the historical context. The apparent paradox is often reconciled by understanding that the absence of explicit legal condemnation or formal prohibition, the lack of laws against it, doesn't automatically equate to widespread celebration or formal social recognition.
Okay, so just because it wasn't illegal doesn't mean it was embraced?
Precisely. It suggests that while same-sex relationships might well have existed, perhaps in private or within specific social circles, maybe more openly in certain times or places than others, they were likely not a prominent feature of public discourse or formal record-keeping. They possibly existed in a more private, maybe tacitly tolerated, or perhaps simply unremarked upon sphere. They didn't fit neatly into our modern binary categories of acceptance or rejection. This kind of tolerated silence is in itself a form of existence, a way society deals with things outside the perceived norm.
And it's absolutely crucial, as you've stressed throughout, not to impose our modern concepts of identity onto these ancient societies.
That's probably the most critical methodological principle for any historian studying this topic. Egyptologists strongly caution, and rightly so, that modern concepts of identity cannot be applied to past societies because these societies themselves did not use such concepts.
They just didn't think that way.
They didn't. There's no known ancient Egyptian vocabulary that describes heterosexuality or homosexuality as fixed inherent identities in the way we understand sexual orientation today. So what responsible scholars do is analyze specific behaviors and relationships that the evidence suggests, attempting to understand them within their own cultural context, rather than trying to identify or label a self-defined ancient identity group or sexual orientation.
And always remembering the filters.
Always remembering the filters. We must continually remind ourselves that the historical record itself is often filtered through later cultural and religious lenses. We saw that with the documented erasure of homosexual elements in some earlier translations of ancient magical spells, or the interpretations provided by later Jewish and Christian scholars imposing their own frameworks. This historical bias means we must always question how narratives have been shaped, reshaped, and potentially distorted over time.
So this raises an important question, really. What is our fundamental responsibility as interpreters of history when dealing with such sensitive and ambiguous topics?
I think it's threefold. First, to avoid anachronism at all costs, not to make the past into a mirror of the present. Second, to scrupulously acknowledge the limits of our knowledge, to be honest about what we don't know and what the evidence can't definitively tell us. And third, to clearly articulate that ancient Egyptians wouldn't have understood our modern questions about sexual identity in the same terms we use today.
So the focus shifts.
Exactly. The focus has to shift from a simplistic, often unanswerable question like, were they gay? To more profound, historically grounded questions like, what evidence exists for these kinds of relationships, for same-sex intimacy or desire? And crucially, how are these phenomena perceived within their own cultural context, whatever that perception may have been positive, negative, indifferent, complex? That shift in approach is absolutely crucial for scholarly integrity and for achieving a more accurate, respectful understanding of the past in all its complexity.
So what does this all mean as we wrap up our deep dive? Our exploration into ancient Egypt reveals a picture, I think it's fair to say, far more complex and compelling than many common assumptions would suggest. On the one hand, women were remarkably empowered, legally and economically independent in ways almost unheard of elsewhere in the ancient world.
Truly exceptional legal standing, yes.
Some even ascended to the ultimate power as pharaohs, displaying a level of personal agency that's just astounding. This robust societal foundation, this legal personhood, undoubtedly laid a fertile ground, potentially, for a diverse spectrum of female relationships, whether platonic, familial, or intimate.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture regarding same-sex relationships, while direct and unambiguous evidence for female same-sex relationships is indeed scarce and requires incredibly careful interpretation, we have to be so cautious we do have these intriguing clues.
Like the Idet and Rui statue.
Exactly. That statue, the later external references to the acts of Egypt in Jewish texts, the disapproving internal Egyptian dream book. These hints exist. But perhaps more significant is the general absence of clear legal prohibitions during much of the pharaonic period. This suggests a degree of tacit tolerance, or perhaps indifference, if not open acceptance.
A tolerance that didn't last.
No. It stands in stark contrast to the later periods under Greco-Roman and especially Christian influence, where disapproval became explicit and punishment was often prescribed. Ultimately, ancient Egypt offered a unique and, for women, a relatively liberal environment compared to its contemporaries. It allowed a degree of personal agency that might very well have encompassed a broader spectrum of relationships and desires, even if these relationships weren't formally recognized or celebrated within their strongly procreation-focused societal structures.
Okay, let's leave our listeners with a final thought. Here's where it gets really interesting, perhaps. Considering how unique ancient Egypt was in its treatment of women, granting them rights and agency far exceeding most ancient cultures, and then considering how those hard-won advancements were later systematically eroded by external cultures, bringing different legal and religious frameworks. What does this extraordinary historical trajectory tell us about the inherent fragility of societal progress, about the continuous, often non-linear, unpredictable journey of gender equality throughout human history?
And building on that, this raises another important question, one that extends far beyond ancient Egypt. If modern biases, as we saw with the love spells, could once literally erase clear evidence of same-sex desire from ancient texts, simply because it didn't fit the translator's worldview? What other narratives, what other aspects of diverse human experience might still be obscured, downplayed, or even completely missed in our current interpretations of history? What profound insights might we still uncover if we continue to re-examine the past, all periods of the past, with even more open, critical, and inclusive eyes, challenging our own assumptions along the way?